It had snowed the night before, a soft, sparkling dust that blanketed the sidewalks of the small town where Margaret had lived for more than 30 years. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, and the houses on Willow Creek Lane shimmered with strings of multicolored lights. Inside her modest two-bedroom home, Margaret moved around with a quiet sort of joy that only mothers know, the kind that's stitched from years of memory, love, and the tiniest flicker of hope. The tree was already glowing in the corner of the living room, decorated with old ornaments from Josh's childhood, his popsicle stick reindeer, a lopsided ceramic bell he painted in second grade, a gingerbread man missing one leg. She had baked 3 different batches of cookie sugar, ginger, and Josh's favorite, chocolate chip. The scent filled the entire house, warm and nostalgic. In the oven, the pot roast she had been slow cooking since dawn let off a rich, savory aroma. She had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing, stretching her small monthly pension just enough to buy a few small, meaningful gifts, things she knew he wouldn't ask for but would appreciate if he noticed. A rare book he'd once mentioned. In passing, a framed photo of him and his father fishing on the lake, a handmade scarf in his favorite navy blue. She even got a modest bottle of the cologne he used to wear when he was home from college. Margaret didn't have much, but she gave everything she had, wrapping each item with meticulous care and writing heartfelt notes to go with them. Her hands were tired and worn, her knees stiff, but her spirit fluttered with anticipation as the clock ticked toward 5 in the evening when Josh had said he'd arrive. Josh hadn't been home for Christmas in 4 years. Ever since his tech startup took off, he had moved to the city, surrounded himself with investors, influencers, and endless distractions. Phone calls became texts. Texts became occasional one-word replies. Margaret had watched from a distance as her son's face popped up in business magazines and LinkedIn features, as he posted photos from parties and overseas trips, never once tagging her or even mentioning her in interviews. Still, she didn't complain. She was proud. She told everyone in town about her son's success, about how he had built his own company from scratch. "That's my Josh," she'd say, beaming with that same old motherly light. She had believed, maybe foolishly, that success would soften him, bring him back not just to her house, but to her heart. So when he texted 2 weeks ago saying he'd try to swing by for a few hours on Christmas Eve, Margaret had cried in relief, then dove headfirst into preparations as if she were planning a state dinner. By 6 o'clock, the guests had already arrived, just a few neighbors who had become like family over the years. Mildred from next door, who brought her famous pecan pie. Carl and Sharon from across the street, who had known Josh since he was in diapers. They made warm small talk in the living room, sipping hot cider and admiring the way Margaret had transformed the little space into something magical. But Margaret's eyes kept drifting to the window, then the clock, then her phone. No word from Josh, no text, no call. Still, she smiled, deflecting concern with well-practiced optimism. "He must have gotten caught in traffic," she said. "You know how the city is?" But as the minutes ticked past 7, her stomach began to twist. The roast had finished cooking. The candles were beginning to burn low. The music had shifted from cheerful carols to quiet background hum. And just as Margaret was beginning to excuse his absence, the door swung open. Josh stepped inside like a gust of cold wind, tall, dressed in a sleek black coat, phone in hand, designer bag slung over his shoulder. He looked around once, expression unreadable, then offered a quick, "Hey, Mom," and walked past her embrace with barely a glance. He didn't see her flinch when he turned his back on her hug. He didn't notice the tremble in her smile. The neighbors greeted him warmly, but he nodded distractedly, already tapping out a message on his phone. "Sorry I'm late," he muttered. "Last-minute client call." Margaret tried to mask her disappointment with joy, ushering him to the table, excited to finally sit down with her son, but he barely glanced at the food. "I already ate," he said. "I had sushi with the team before I left." Then he reached into his pocket and tossed a gift bag onto the couch like a discarded receipt. Didn't know what to get you? Here's some cash. Margaret walked over to the bag, hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a crumpled $50 bill and a Starbucks gift card. No note, no thought, no love. And then, as if to add insult to injury, Josh chuckled and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, maybe now you can stop leeching off me and make your own money. The laughter wasn't light or teasing. It was sharp, condescending, and bitter. The room went silent. Sharon's fork clinked softly against her plate. Mildred stared at her hands. Carl looked down, his jaw tight. Margaret stood there, the bag still in her hand, the money like a slap across her face. Her cheeks flushed red, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Pain, disbelief, a sorrow so sharp. It nearly knocked the wind from her lungs. She set the bag down slowly, almost reverently, then offered a thin smile to her guests. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice catching. She walked into the kitchen, hands braced against the counter as the weight of it all came crashing down. The air felt heavier there, quieter. She could still hear laughter drifting from the living room, but none of it reached her. She looked around at the food she had spent days preparing, the table she had set with her best china, the lights she had strung with care. It all felt foolish, now childish, even like she had been playing house, pretending that love still lived in this home. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, eyes locked on the simple joy sign hanging above the sink. It mocked her. Margaret didn't cry, not yet, but something inside her shifted. Took a deep breath and stood up straighter, her body still aching from the years, but her heart suddenly steady. In the drawer beneath the sink was a file folder. She reached for it, hands moving with purpose now, the pain replaced by resolve. Inside the folder were papers, old, yellowed, but meticulously organized. Her husband, Richard, had been a cautious man, but also generous. Before he passed away, 10 years ago, he had made quiet investments in a small medical tech company that Margaret never touched. She had lived frugally, choosing pride over luxury, silence over entitlement. But those investments had blossomed millions now, tucked away in a trust account that bore her name and hers alone. She had never used the money, not once. She wanted Josh to build his own life. She wanted to teach him humility. She thought she had. She had been wrong. She clutched the folder to her chest and closed her eyes. In that moment, 1,000 memories flooded back, Josh's tiny hands wrapped around hers. His laughter echoing through the house as a child. It's the way he used to bring her dandelions from the yard, whispering, "For you, Mama." She had held on to that version of him for so long. But the man in the living room, the one who tossed money at her like she was a beggar, that man was a stranger, and Margaret had given strangers enough grace by the time she returned to the living room. The guests were gathering their coats, murmuring soft goodbyes, sensing the awkward tension that now clung to the walls. Josh was on his phone again, scrolling, with disinterest. Margaret walked over and touched his arm gently. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "I packed you a plate," she said simply, her voice even. "For the road." He shrugged. "Cool. I'll grab it in a sec." "No need," she replied, handing him the container. "I'll walk you out." He blinked, a little confused, but followed her to the door. Snow had started falling again, a slow drift that softened everything it touched. Margaret opened the door and stood aside. Josh lingered for a moment, expecting something more, an apology, a plea, a hug. But none came. Just a tired, steady gaze that he couldn't quite read. "Merry Christmas." "Josh," she said. He nodded slowly, then stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind him. Margaret locked it. Then she turned off the lights, walked back to the table, and sat down alone beside the untouched roast. She didn't cry. Instead, she took a sip of cider, looked around at her quiet home, and let the silence settle like snow. She had been humiliated, but she had also been awakened. And while her heart still ached, something fierce had been born. Inside her that night, something her son would one day reckon with. But not tonight. Tonight she will rest, because tomorrow everything will change. The next morning, the snow still gently blanketed the streets like untouched linen. But inside Margaret's house, the warmth had drained, leaving only echoes of disappointment. The remnants of the previous evening's heartbreak lingered like a stain in the air, half-eaten food, untouched gifts. And the stillness of a room that had expected laughter but received scorn. Margaret woke early, not from rest, but from the unease that clung to her chest. She sat at the edge of her bed, her hands folded over her lap, staring into the pale light seeping through the curtains. She wasn't angry, not in the screaming, table-flipping way the world often defined rage. Her fury had matured into something colder, quieter resolve. It was a strange and powerful feeling to realize that the child you birthed and nurtured could hurt you not out of ignorance, out of entitlement, and worse, without a flicker of remorse. She stood up slowly, each joint protesting her movement, and shuffled toward the old writing desk in the corner of her room. Inside the bottom drawer was a worn envelope, yellowed from time, its corners curled like old parchment. She hadn't touched it in years, but she always knew where it was. With trembling fingers, she opened it and laid its contents on the table, a series of documents neatly clipped and labeled. Her husband's life insurance policy, his death certificate, and most importantly, the stock certificates and trust paperwork for the company he had invested in just months. Before he died, it had started as a small investment, barely $5,000 into a little-known medical device firm that had been trying to get FDA approval for a breakthrough in portable heart monitors. Richard had always believed in betting on the underdog, and that instinct, coupled with his brilliance in accounting, paid off. The company went public a year after his death, and the shares skyrocketed. But Margaret had never cashed them out. Instead, she let them sit, slowly accumulating value, untouched and invisible to the world. She hadn't needed much. After Richard passed, she retired early and made do with her modest pension. She cleaned homes part-time when she needed extra money. She mended neighbors' clothes, helped at the local clinic for free, and took pride in not being a burden on anyone, not even her son. But last night, when Josh flung that $50 bill at her like she was a beggar on the street, something inside her cracked. She had protected him from poverty, but in doing so, she had also shielded him from empathy. She had allowed him to believe he was above her sacrifices, that his success was self-made rather than built on the back of a mother who chose to suffer silently. She picked up the phone and called her lawyer, Gregory Shaw, meticulous, soft-spoken, man who had helped Richard set up the original investment plan. His voice was warm when he answered. "Margaret," he said, surprised. "It's been years. Is everything all right?" "I need to make some changes," she said, her voice even steady. "I want to move the assets into a private trust one with conditions. And I want to revise my will." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" he asked carefully. "Yes," she replied. "I've been quiet for too long." For the next several days, Margaret met with Gregory multiple times. They crafted a new trust that would protect the inheritance now valued at over $7 million from ever falling into the wrong hands. It stipulated that Josh would not inherit a cent unless he met 3 conditions. He had to complete a year of service in a charitable or medical nonprofit. He had to attend weekly therapy sessions and provide progress reports. And he had to reconcile with his mother publicly and sincerely. Until then, every cent of the money would be used to fund causes that Margaret believed in. With the legal work handled, turned her attention to the world outside her window. She reached out to the local women's shelter and donated enough to refurbish their sleeping quarters and install a security system. She funded a scholarship program for young single mothers returning to school. She also used a portion of the inheritance to lease a small but charming storefront in the center of town. One she turned into a community cafe and workspace for retired nurses and healthcare workers who, like her, were too young to feel useless, but too old to be seen. The cafe became a hub almost overnight. It was called Second Breath, and it featured hand-painted mugs, a donation box for free meals, and a library of medical books and journals donated by Margaret herself. Nurses taught free CPR classes there. Volunteers offered health screenings. Locals dropped by to read, donate, and reconnect. For the first time in years, Margaret felt alive. She was no longer waiting for her son's attention to validate her worth. She was making an impact, and it wasn't quiet anymore. News of her cafe spread across town. The local newspaper featured a profile on her titled "The Nurse Who Brought Hope Back." People who had once pitied her now respected her. They called her generous, visionary, and graceful. But Margaret wasn't doing it for the headlines. Every cup of coffee she brewed, every mother she hugged, every class she taught was a declaration. I was never just someone's mother, I was someone. Still, she didn't speak to Josh. Not out of revenge, but because silence, in its own way, had become sacred. Meanwhile, the world Josh had so proudly built began to shift beneath his feet. His startup had overextended itself in international markets, and two key investors pulled out. The company faced a class action lawsuit for a privacy breach, and layoffs followed. His name, once heralded as the next Elon Musk, was now dragged across blogs and forums with words like reckless, entitled, and tone-deaf. His apartment lease ended and he downsized. His phone calls became fewer and more desperate. And for the first time since his teenage years, Josh found himself alone, not just physically, but emotionally. One afternoon, months after Christmas, Josh returned to his childhood hometown, looking worn. His coat was faded, and the confident swagger that once defined him had dulled into a kind of searching aimlessness. He walked past a crowd gathered outside a storefront with a painted sign that read "Second Breath." Inside, he saw people laughing, children playing, and at the center of it all, his mother. She wore a green apron dusted with flour and smiled as she handed a slice of cake to a teenage girl who looked on the verge of tears. The entire cafe moved with a rhythm that was alive and human and real. Josh stared through the glass, stunned. He had never seen her this way, radiant, fulfilled, important. He stepped inside hesitantly, and the room fell into a brief hush before returning to its usual hum. Margaret looked up. Their eyes met. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered. She didn't rush to him. Instead, she walked calmly to the counter, removed her apron, Skrutsuka, and met him near the back table where she always hosted newcomers. "Hi, Josh," she said simply. "Mom?" "I didn't know," he began, but she raised a hand gently. "I know." Sat down across from her, unsure what to do with his hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" He asked that you had all this, that you were doing this. "'Cause you never asked," she said softly, and I was done waiting to be seen. Okay. There was silence between them then, thick and heavy with memory. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I was helping by giving you that money." "I thought—" "No, Josh," she interrupted, not harshly, but with firmness. "You weren't helping. You were diminishing. You forgot where you came from. You forgot who held your hand through your nightmares, who skipped meals so you could eat, who stitched your pants and clapped at your spelling bees. I didn't need your money. I needed your presence. Your respect." He looked down, eyes glassy. "I've lost everything," he murmured. "The company's tanking. I have no savings. I didn't know where else to go." Margaret nodded slowly. "You're here now. That's a start. But if you're here for a handout, there won't. B1, the trust is locked. The terms are strict." He blinked. "What trust?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a small card. "Gregory Shaw is still our family lawyer. Call him if you want to understand what comes next." He took the card, staring at it like it held the answer to a riddle he didn't know he was part of. "You really locked me out of everything." "No." she said, standing. "I gave you a way back in, but you'll have to earn it." As she turned to help a customer, Josh sat still, 1,000 thoughts colliding in his head. For the first time in his adult life, he was being asked to change not through scolding or guilt, but through action. And as he looked around at the cafe full of lives touched by the woman he had once called a burden, something inside him cracked. Not out of defeat, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, Margaret didn't look back. She knew he wasn't fixed. That would take time. But she had finally set her boundary. And in doing so, she had redefined everything: who she was, what she stood for, and how she would be remembered. Not as someone who was thrown $50 like a stray dog, but as a woman who turned that insult into an empire of hope. Silent inheritance wasn't just money, was power. And now it was being used for something far greater than her son's ego. It was being used for redemption. Hers, and maybe eventually his too. The wind that carried the snow across Willow Creek Lane that Christmas morning was gentle, but biting. A reminder that some things like winter and wounds took time to thaw. Margaret stood by the window of her now transformed cafe, second breath, watching a line of volunteers unload boxes of donated blankets and gifts. The warmth inside the cafe stood in sharp contrast to the frost outside. Fairy lights twinkled along the windows, and a tall Christmas tree shimmered in the corner beside a fireplace that had only recently been installed. Children laughed as they decorated sugar cookies. Women in scrubs handed out warm cocoa. A jazz trio played quietly in the background, giving the room an elegant, festive pulse. Margaret moved through the room like a current, graceful, composed, dignified. A year had passed since the Christmas that cracked her heart open, and she had rebuilt herself from the ruins. But not in secret. This time, her power was public. Her face had appeared in 3 local magazines. She'd given a TEDx talk in the city. Her cafe had become a cornerstone of the town, a place of healing, of rebirth. And today she was being honored not just as a host, but as the keynote speaker for the town's holiday charity gala. It was her day. But Margaret wasn't thinking of applause. Her mind, despite everything, still drifted to her son. She hadn't heard from Josh in months, not since that fragile conversation in the back corner of the cafe when she handed him Gregory's card. She had wondered, sometimes aloud, whether he'd ever call, whether he'd ever try. But she refused to take a pause. She kept living, building, giving. And today, she wasn't going to wait by the window for someone who might never arrive. She had already waited enough in her lifetime. Outside, the snow crunched under the weight of slow, hesitant footsteps. Josh stood just beyond the doorway, of second breath, staring through the window like a child, unsure if he was allowed inside. His once stylish coat was faded, the edges frayed. His face was thinner, sharper, eyes a shade darker than Margaret remembered. There were lines on his forehead, not from age, but from struggle. Life had humbled him. He had taken on contract work, started volunteering at a food bank in the city, and eventually joined a community outreach program for tech literacy. It was during those late nights teaching elderly clients how to use tablets and email that Josh began to understand the kind of patience and empathy his mother had lived by. Slowly, painfully, he began to transform, not because of punishment or force, but because, for the first time, he wanted to earn something deeper than a check. He wanted to earn his way back to her. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, the sound of laughter, the smell of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts, the clink of mugs and soft strains of a saxophone. And at the center of it all, illuminated by a soft spotlight, stood Margaret. She looked radiant, elegant in a deep green dress, her silver hair pulled back in a low chignon. She held a microphone in one hand, her other resting lightly on the podium. And to the women in this room, she was saying, her voice clear and steady, who were told they were too old, too poor, or too broken to be anything but invisibilized. See you? I was you. And I want you to know your worth has never been tied to the approval of others, not your children, not your husbands, not even your past. You are worthy because you endure, because you rebuild, because you choose kindness when the world gives you cruelty." The audience erupted in applause. Josh stood frozen at the back, hands clenched. People were rising to their feet, whistling, cheering. One woman next to him whispered, "She's something else, isn't she?" And Josh nodded because she was. When the applause died down and the music resumed, Margaret stepped down from the podium, smiling as people came up to hug her, to shake her hand, to say thank you. She greeted them all warmly, but then her eyes, lifted and found him. For a heartbeat, everything went still. She didn't rush toward him. She didn't look away. She simply nodded, as if she'd been expecting this moment for a long time. Josh walked forward slowly, his breath catching in his throat. When he reached her, he tried to speak, but the words stumbled and tangled. Mom, I know I should have come sooner. I didn't know how to say it, but I'm sorry for Christmas, for everything." His voice cracked. "I was cruel and arrogant and blind. And I hurt you." Margaret watched him quietly. Her face was unreadable. And then she spoke not with the sting of reprimand, but the weight of clarity. "You threw money at me to make me feel small," she said. "But I remembered who I was. I didn't need your money. I needed you to remember your heart." Her words landed like anchors. Josh's eyes welled and he lowered his gaze, unable to speak. "I don't expect forgiveness," he whispered. I want to try. I've been working, volunteering, trying to change. Not to get anything from you. It's just because I want to be someone you could be proud of again." Margaret inhaled deeply and then reached into her bag. She pulled out a small envelope, plain, white, and sealed. "This is a letter from Gregory," she said. "He's updated the trust. I kept the conditions the same. A year of nonprofit service, therapy, and reconciliation. Not just with me, with yourself." Josh took the envelope carefully, like it might dissolve in his hands. "You're not entitled to my fortune," Margaret said firmly, "but you're still my son. Start there." Josh nodded, overwhelmed. "I will, I promise." The two stood in silence for a moment longer. Then Margaret reached forward and smoothed a wrinkle from his collar. It's a small gesture, but filled with something old and familiar. She didn't pull him in, but she didn't pull away either. "There's food in the back," she said. "You're welcome to stay." He blinked. "Are you sure?" "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "But I have boundaries. If you stay, you help. No more pity. No more pride. Just people helping people. That's what we do here." Josh smiled softly for the first time in months. "Okay, deal." That afternoon, Josh picked up trays of cookies. He wiped down tables. He helped a little boy refill his hot cocoa. He watched his mother laugh with guests, saw the way people looked at her not as someone to be pitied, but someone to be admired. For years, he thought success was money and press releases. But watching her now, he understood that true success was legacy, and hers was profound. As dusk fell and the cafe emptied, Margaret sat at the piano near the window, playing soft chords as the room dimmed. Josh stood beside her, listening, a cup of cider in hand. "I forgot you could play," he said quietly. "You never noticed," she replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. He chuckled. "That's fair. They didn't need to say more." There was no grand reunion, no cinematic hug. But there was presence. And for Margaret, that was enough. As the snow fell once more outside and the lights of Second Breath flickered like stars behind glass, Margaret smiled to herself. This time Christmas had given her something deeper than gifts or regret. It had given her a moment of truth. She wasn't just Josh's mother anymore. She wasn't just someone's widow. She was Margaret Ellis, founder, nurse, healer, force of nature. And that was more than enough. As she closed the cafe that night, locking the doors with tired hands but a full heart, she looked back at her son sweeping up confetti from the floor. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was honest. And in that honesty, she found peace. Whatever came next, she was ready. She always had been.